Greg Soden. One of the clearest lessons I've learned from my years of teaching about religion and discussing religion is that religion is everywhere. Religion inspires the decisions people make on a day-to-day basis in their personal and professional lives. The crossover of religion into secular society is interesting, and my interest was piqued recently when I saw the title of a new book from NYU Press, Wanamaker's Temple, The Business of Religion in an Iconic Department Store, by Dr. Nicole Kirk. John Wanamaker was an iconic businessman in Philadelphia who lived from 1838 to 1922. He founded the Wanamaker's Department Store in 1876 and was crucial in changing how Americans shop, celebrate, and congregate. He also deeply believed his wealth was blessed by God and that he had a duty to offer moral guidance to Philadelphia at a time when people believed Protestant Christianity's influence in the United States was in decline. If you're going to Philadelphia, the scenes we describe can largely still be seen. The Wanamaker Building, home to the iconic department store's heyday, is in Philadelphia, with its trademark Wanamaker organ, the 2,500-pound bronze eagle sculpture, and 12-story grand court atrium. The building received a National Historic Landmark distinction in 1978 and is currently the home of Macy's. I had a wonderful conversation with Nicole Kirk about the life, context, business, and religion depicted in Wanamaker's Temple, The Business of Religion in an Iconic Department Store, out now from NYU Press. Dr. Nicole Kirk is a historian of American religious history, associate professor in the Frank and Alice Schulman Chair of Unitarian Universalist History at Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago, Illinois. She joined the faculty at Meadville Lombard in 2012 after earning her Ph.D. in American Religious History at Princeton Theological Seminary. As always, if you like this show, please consider rating it where you get podcasts. You can write to me at classicalideas@outlook.com, find me on Twitter at classical_ideas, or on Facebook at facebook.com/classicalideaspodcast. I really enjoyed Wanamaker's Temple, which is a piece of overlooked history I never would have learned about if I didn't do this show. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Nicole Kirk. Dr. Nicole Kirk, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Can you just take a moment and sort of introduce yourself, what you do, and where you are in the world for the listeners?
Thanks, Greg. I am the Frank and Alice Schulman Professor of Unitarian Universalist History at a seminary here in Chicago, Meadville Lombard Theological School. We're celebrating our 175th anniversary, and we're a seminary that primarily trains religious leaders for Unitarian Universalism, faith tradition, but also other faith traditions.
Wonderful. So one of my favorite conversations I ever had for this show was with a Unitarian Universalist minister, and it was delightful. So that's great to hear. So we're going to talk about all kinds of great stuff today. You have a new book out that we're going to talk about, but I'm kind of interested a little bit in guest history whenever we start conversations. How did you come to be interested in the academic study of religion? Like, what are some crucial moments in your educational journey?
I attended a small liberal arts college, Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, and they had strong humanities, as a liberal arts college would, strong humanities professors, and I was interested in history. I was interested in English. I was interested in political science. In fact, I tried on all those majors, but it was finally in a moment when I had a class at that time called World Religions with a professor, Bill Young, and I realized that the study of religion, religious studies, brought in political science, history, sacred text, and writing, and I thought this is a way to study parts of all of those academic disciplines, but also how it really shapes people's lives and how they live in the world.
Wonderful. I had an experience similar to that just down the road at Mizzou, where I had Philip Clark, who's like an East Asian and Chinese scholarship religious studies professor, and it was brilliant. I totally understand where you're coming from as far as that being a transformative educational moment, because you see religion is everywhere around you. You know what I mean? It's in everything in society. Awesome. Okay, so where did you go to after that undergrad program that led to where you are now?
Well, I spent 4 years at Westminster, and then I went over to Vanderbilt for a Master of Divinity. And over time, it took a while before I came back for the Ph.D., and I did that at Princeton Theological Seminary. That
religious history that you got really into led to this new book that I've just read from you that I absolutely love, Wanamaker's Temple, The Business of Religion in an Iconic Department Store. And when I saw this title in the New York University Press catalog, I was really, really intrigued, because tying together business and religion is something that fascinates me. So let's talk about the bare bones. When did you first learn about John Wanamaker?
It was my first year of my PhD. I was in a survey course on American religious history, and we read Consumer Rights by Lee Eric Schmidt, who happened to be over at the university. And I was fascinated about the development of American holidays and how religion both shaped the holidays, but also some of the holiday traditions were changing religion. And one of the examples he frequently came back to was American department stores, and in particular, John Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia, although he also had a New York branch, in part because the archive is so rich for Wanamaker. And I was completely drawn in, and discovered that there had been some other writings about Wanamaker, Land of Desire by William Leach, and that, in fact, he shows up in many historians' discussions of business and religion, or commerce and religion. He is the darling of many material culturalists because, again, the archive is so rich. And I discovered that no one had really spent time doing a lengthy discussion about his blending of business and religion. And so I saw this opening, and I went to the archives as my first year of my PhD, and I discovered this treasure trove of information. He's not terribly self-reflective in the ways that historians, hope for, but there was still so much there to work with and to learn about that is poured into this book.
You must have felt so lucky as a first-year PhD student to stumble across what would eventually become like this vast research possibility.
Yes. I mean, how many folks necessarily land on their dissertation topic that later becomes edited and refined book for publication their first year? And so so in this way, I've spent a long time with John Wanamaker. Yeah,
I'd imagine you might even be looking forward to moving on to other projects at this point as well. So, yes. So Wanamaker lives from 1838 to 1922. And in the book, you write, this is a quote, between 1840 and 1890, 7.5 million Irish and German people poured into American cities. Most of these immigrants were Catholic or Jewish, upsetting the Protestant majority at a moment when Protestants already felt vulnerable. So can you tell us a little bit about the context of Protestant panic in which Wanamaker arose as a public figure?
Well, a lot of this is due to the changes in the movement of populations in the United States, the still forming United States, and how cities and the urban milieu, the urban environment, is changing where people live. So many people, especially young men, are leaving their small rural villages and towns, and they are coming to these large cities. So family structures as they know it are breaking down. Church circles, as people understand their relationships, are breaking down. And there's this influx of young men looking for work without the ties, and one could even say the surveillance of church and home and family, and so they can get into trouble rather quickly. And so people are seeing this as the cities are growing, even the church, because American cities, as they were growing, they in many ways were these small towns, much like Chicago and New York City. We still talk about the neighborhoods, or even Philadelphia. They were very much those neighborhoods were cohesive, almost like little villages in themselves, much more than they are today. And so those were breaking down because it was growing so fast, and new groups of people would come in and destabilize groups that had been populating one area that was forming a neighborhood. So between that and then again this outside migration and in particular Judaism and especially Catholicism, new ways of work life. People are feeling that life as they know it is coming apart at the seams, and they're particularly worried about the morality. Moral fabric of society, the moral fabric of this nation. And as other scholars have shown, and this is certainly part of my work, is that they believe if the country is not having this moral stability, that overall this United States is would have trouble continuing as it being a successful growing country. So they're worried about it for their salvation, personal salvation. They're worried about it for their community salvation. They're worried about the United States. Actually, Catherine Jin Lum has done a lot of work about this in her book, Damned Nation, looking about the history of hell and damnation in America. And that's a part of that story.
So how does Wanamaker fit in? I'm curious what motivates him to get into the values and morals business through retail. So as he's building this business empire, what specifically does Wanamaker see as like the major struggle of American society?
Well, he was torn from the very beginning between ministry and being a merchant. Mm-hmm. And ministry, one of the biggest barriers was health. He had a rather delicate disposition, which is almost amusing from our point of view because the man lived into his 80s and outlived most of his family. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he would have these horrible colds every year and this lung condition. And his lungs were damaged somewhat during his early work in retail. There was poor ventilation and things like that. And so people said the demands of ministry, which I train ministers, I'm a professor at a seminary. It's true. Ministry is a very demanding position. And so he worried about this. At the same time, his desire to be a merchant was tainted by the fact that many people had a poor view of retail and that it was a illicit business almost. Now, this is something that ebb and flows in the history of the United States and also the American colonies. There's times when it's viewed more positive. There's times when people are preaching against it in the pulpits. And certainly in this second half of the 19th century, it is an issue. And so he's hearing that critique. He's worried about that. Dwight L. Moody, whom he supports in his both ministry and seminary and also his revivals, is using the techniques of business to be so successful in his revivals, and at the same time judges Wanamaker and others who are in retail because it's not as good as perhaps other businesses. So he was torn.
Yeah, the idea of business and religion is really interesting, and there's a lot of modern critiques about what religion has become that might be at odds with what we see as the purpose of business. So I want to talk about the two words that are in your subtitle, business and religion, which is in the title of the book. So these two words seem to be somewhat at odds until Wanamaker decides to associate them. Is that accurate? Was he like a pioneer in combining business and religion in American life?
No.
Okay.
This has been a trend throughout American religious history. And it's been done different ways by folks. In one way of looking at Wanamaker's breakthroughs is that he was pretty open about it. He was, despite the pushback and people saying that these don't mix and they make fun of him, and joke about him being Pious John. This especially when he exposed himself to this kind of newspapers and cartoons when he got into politics, so he became this target. But you can look, and this is not the simple argument of the Puritans and capitalism. It certainly ebbed and flowed, but Mark Valeri in his book, Heavenly Merchandise, looks at how this is working in the 1700s in Boston with merchants and ministers. So, and you can even see it today, although much more subtle. And a lot of people will look to the examples of Chick-fil-A or Interstate Battery, or even the tension and arguments around Hobby Lobby and how business and religion is being mixed in that context, even Walmart. But Wanamaker is this is who he is, and he's pretty upfront about it. But he's also, everything he's doing is often seen through this lens. So when he talks about some of the things that he's saying is best practices, it's related to how he thinks about morality, which is shaped and framed by his Protestant religious sensibilities and commitments.
Gotcha. So in the book, you say that Wanamaker believes that God has blessed his wealth.
Yes.
How does he make sense of that? Like, how does he explain that and justify that to his critics?
And this is, again, where he's not as self-reflective as one would like. From what I can found in his writings is that he wasn't apologetic about it. He truly believed this, and he would, Russell Conwell, although Baptist and Wanamaker was Presbyterian, they were great friends. Russell Conwell, many people point to, especially with his famous lecture that he gave on the Chautauqua Circuit, Acres of Diamonds, as one of the originators of the prosperity gospel, the gospel of wealth. A version of this, of course, Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie's using the term gospel of wealth. He believes that you can, if you are dedicating yourself and living a good life, you will be blessed by success. And then if you take that success, and in this case, great wealth, tremendous wealth, and that you give back to society and you do it in moral and good ways, and take care of that money, that money is going to ends to support the making of the kingdom of God, then you'll be further blessed. It's kind of this circular prosperity gospel. And so he didn't really struggle with it, question it. This was just how he viewed and lived in the world.
Interesting. So, and I know that he takes this into the training of his staff, like he incorporated morals into his staff training for the people that worked in his store. So when training staff, what did Wanamaker expect of his staff that is like religious in nature?
Well, and I mean, it's subtle in some ways looking at this. If you take it at face value in one ways, you would say, oh, well, he's just training them how to dress and how to move and do their jobs. But there's this strong thread of morality, and that morality and those ideas of morals are Christian morals for him. And it's very paternalistic. At the same time, people talked about how much he would do for them, and finding memories of children who grew up in the school, in the store school. So I should back up and say he was very concerned about his young workers, his youngest workers. And so he started a school and then a summer camp to continue their education, even though they had to work to help support their families. And he was sent out to work rather early as an errand boy, and then later found his way into retail. And so he was concerned about people's lack of education, but also he wanted to teach them business. So it was helping to perpetuate his business, because he would train folks who would spend their entire career with him. But also, if they went out into the world, he hoped to teach them a Christian idea of business, what he called the golden rule of business, and that would infuse retail and make it over into a Christian practice, a Christian money-making enterprise.
Did Wanamaker do a good job of lifting up and training all of his employees?
No. First of all, when he was starting out, he started just with his youngest young men. And then the young women started agitating and saying, we would like these programs. They also had the older workers. But when I'm talking about these workers, these are his workers with white identities. And his African-American workers did have access to some education and music programs, but they were never at the same level as his workers who were white. And the African-American workers, there was always a smaller number, it was about 300, although some stores in their racism would even hire African-Americans. But they were kept in service roles, elevator operators, serving food in some of the restaurants behind the scenes. And at the same time, this is an interesting, he's certainly a man of his time. And so Wanamaker really believed that people, if they worked hard enough and they applied themselves, that you could move your way up, or at least that's what he liked to say. He would say this to African-American audiences. He was invited by Booker T. Washington to speak to an African-American businessman's audience, and he would say this over and over, that people, and all people, and so he's saying to my African-American workers, they can move their way up, and yet none of them are promoted. And in fact, later research after Wanamaker, some of the work around social justice and the NAACP discovered that the department stores along Market Street in Philadelphia had agreement not to hire any sales clerks who were African American, and that was challenged and finally broken through in the 40s and early 50s.
Gotcha. So Wanamaker has what you write in the book as being his religious philosophy of material wealth. And so today, I look around and I see that being like a billionaire or a millionaire or very wealthy and being Christian aren't really seen as being diametrically opposed to each other. So is this period of Wanamaker like a crucial piece of American history that helps explain like our current environment?
It certainly helps us understand it better, I think. The dynamic dance of religion and business. And in this case, and then the Rockefeller and Carnegie, and certainly how they are understanding the tremendous wealth that they are accumulating and what should be done with it. And in those cases, though, it's very different. So they say we must make society better. We must support. And so Carnegie's building all these libraries. Rockefeller's giving back education and all kinds of ways in different communities. And so it helps us see this today. It's some of the historical roots, but also some of the differences and some big changes in that relationship between religion and business. But it's always been there. It's just how that dance plays out has changed.
Excellent. So in the book you write, this is a quote again, his innovative efforts are a part of a long line of Protestant efforts to blend religion and business, efforts that expanded in the 20th century and continue today, which you just sort of discussed. So what explicitly can we see today as like a byproduct of Wanamaker? Like, do you see anything in Chicago where you live or like cities around the country where we can confidently say like, without John Wanamaker, XYZ might not exist quite in that way?
In terms of business or retail practice or religion?
Either.
Well, in history, and there's always that desire to say, here's the one reason, or here's the one person.
Sure.
But it is never just one person. It's a group of people and these dynamic forces. So Wanamaker certainly was one of the leaders who helped revolutionize retail. So the retail practices that we assume that are a part of our everyday lives are partly the product of Wanamaker and other leaders who move American retail away from haggling for prices to one price tag for all people, who invite browsing. And this is, of course, also related to the great exhibitions, the World's Fairs, and where you can't buy anything. All that's about browsing. And so they bring that into retail where you can buy almost everything. Mm-hmm. And you can also look. But before that became a regular retail convention, you had to enter a store and know that you were going to buy. Wanamaker, in terms of religion, again, here is a leader, and he's not just a member of a church. He starts a church. He starts it through a Sunday school mission. He very much believes in Protestant Christianity, a Presbyterian version, with a revivalistic thread, and he starts this Sunday school and then starts this megachurch of the day. I mean, thousands of members, thousands in the Sunday school, but it's also an institutional church that provides community services to the wider community.
And he tells his friends, I love this quote, "My stores will be a pulpit for me." And Wanamaker seems to turn his store into like a version of like what you just said, like a religious revival and a Christian mission in the heart of urban America. So how does he use like the physical building in sort of like a religious way? Because he has these like displays and he does all kinds of events. So what's going on that's like inside his store that's like religiously inspired or religious in nature?
Indeed. So, and it, that quote, the store will be my pulpit. I love that quote. He said it a couple of times different ways. And actually in his letters, when people are writing critiques, that's one of the few times he is self-reflective that we have. And this is going back to your earlier question before I talk about the building. And he wasn't defensive. He would just say, why is this a problem? I see that religion and business belong together, and that my business supports my religion and my religion supports my business. What's the conflict here? In terms of the building, he had several buildings. He had several store locations in Philadelphia. It wasn't until 1875, 1876 when he opened an annex that later became the location of the major department store, what became the department store. And it was a little bit farther than the regular retail track. And he had bought an old train depot. And so you can imagine the glass train shed.
Oh, yeah.
This is where, so lights coming in.
Love
and
that.
This acreage almost actually of merchandise, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the original building. And he had gone to the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, the Columbian Exposition, and he had visited Marshall Field's new department store building that was being put up in 3 phases by the architect Daniel Burnham. And so Wanamaker went with Daniel Burnham. Now, what's interesting about the Burnham connection is Daniel Burnham and others were also part of the City Beautiful movement that believed that some of the plight of urban living could be corrected or shaped or changed by good architecture and parks and open, beautiful spaces, and that these spaces would inspire people to act in better, more cordial, and even more moral ways. And so you have this architect who's already a part of this movement in shaping American urban contexts, who is building these department stores.
Awesome.
Or designing them. So, yeah.
That's really cool. And so earlier we mentioned that Protestant influence in society was kind of like waning, and that a lot of people were kind of concerned about this decline in influence and what they saw as an increase in amorality or immorality in the cities. And how does Wanamaker help stave off Protestant power decline? Does he help reverse any of this decline that he is so worried about? Like, does he feel successful?
Well, and that's what I argue in the book. It's actually not a decline, it's a transformation. So The power is not necessarily declining, it is changing in its expression, it's changing in how it's being funneled. And what is perceived to be decline is creating this moment of creative response and creativity. And so people are thinking of new ways to bring religion into people's lives. And so all these moral reform movements are developing. You have the Young Men's Christians Association, the YMCA, etc. And he's also in his building thinking that this can be a part, one of the many tools, as well as his church, as well as his Sunday school, as well as his efforts for the YMCA, that his department store building is just as much a tool for this helping society come back in the Protestant fold.
Awesome. About half hour ago, I mentioned some statistics about immigration that were happening during Wanamaker's life. Does Wanamaker have any role in bridge building or bridging any divides between Protestants and the large influx of Catholic immigrants to arrive in the USA during his lifespan? Does he have any bridge building that he is doing at this time?
That's a great question. And it was something I was really interested in discovering, because at many of these citywide events that were centered on his store, whether it was the dedication of the building in 1911 or the various parades, and if there wasn't something to celebrate, Wanamaker and his team would often develop something to celebrate. Mm-hmm. And so you would have his employees marching in their cadet uniforms as a part of the school with this military framework, with a military band, and he would invite the cardinal, and he would invite a local rabbi, and many times it would be the same religious leaders from these various groups. How far those relationships went, I had trouble teasing out, and so it still remains a question for me. So he definitely had relationships with Catholic leaders and Jewish leaders. And, I have him writing letters also to Phoebe Palmer and other religious leaders of the time who don't even live in Philadelphia. So he was a connector and a networker, but at times it's difficult to see how deep those relationships go. Now, Dwight L. Moody, they're very close. Russell Conwell, there's definite evidence of a deep relationship. With these other religious leaders, it's a little bit difficult. But I know I was able to find some places where I think there was some influence on what he did for his community. So there was a penny savings bank that was developed by some of the Catholic leaders in Philadelphia. And soon after, then he started his. So to help people, much like we talk about today, where folks don't have access to banking, and so that causes problems in their movement in the world and being able to buy things. So Wanamaker is addressing a similar issue of his time when people have no place to save their money or secure it.
Excellent. Earlier you mentioned some modern companies, Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A. If I were to apply for a job at either of these companies today, it's well documented what the beliefs that are guiding the organizations are like, because I can go and find those in any major news publication. Were Wanamaker employees aware of how seriously he took his religious practices, or were they just in there buying stuff because that's what people do?
I think it's the both and. It just depends how much paying attention. If you're part of his school programs, you're having a moral well check visit to your home, and your parents are being interviewed and they're being advised on how to raise you properly. When you go to the summer camp, you're having religious services, but that's also part of the time. And so that wouldn't be necessarily extraordinary. You would almost expect it. At the same time, the radio station that he opened and was broadcast from the top of his store would broadcast the sermons from his church. And when that was the opening day of that radio station, he had the minister from his church come and do opening words and do a prayer. So it's both something folks may not notice because it was so much a part of the soup they were swimming in. And at the same time, there were certainly elements where it might stand out. So you go to this art gallery that's inside the store, and there's many religious pictures. Although here's a Protestant who collects religious images of that are shaped by the Catholic milieu, and often by Catholic artists. And so that's also an interesting element.
Gotcha. Something that I really liked in the book is when you wrote about how some shoppers have like religious experiences in the store. Did the shoppers get on board with the shopping as a moral endeavor idea that Wanamaker had? What did they believe they were benefiting morally by shopping? Tell me about the shoppers.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I didn't spend as much time on the reception history, but I did discover these moments during this exact time of year, Lent, leading up the 40 days leading up to Easter. This is after actually John Wanamaker's death. His son Rodman took these two massive paintings by Mihai Munkaci, this Hungarian artist that Wanamaker had developed this relationship with. These were his two paintings, Christ Before Pilate and Christ at Calvary, or Christ at Golgotha. These two paintings were world famous. Some people talked about it being perhaps the most famous paintings at the time. And during John Wanamaker's lifetime, he kept them in a particular special gallery, and that they were at floor level. So it was almost as if you could walk into the paintings. And because there's such the size and the scale of the paintings, it really does feel like you can walk into them, because I've been able to see them. I traveled to Hungary last year and found where they were and went to visit them and spent, I was very lucky. There was no one in the gallery, and there was a third painting. It was part of actually a trilogy, but Wanamaker had these two paintings. And it was an experience to just study the color and the movement and feel like I could walk right into the scene about Jesus and Pontius Pilate. I could walk into the scene of Jesus hanging on the cross and the two thieves on either side, and looking at the crowd and the various emotions that are expressed, everything from outrage to weeping and everything in between. And so these paintings, after John's death, his son Rodman put them inside the grand court, the central space with an organ. So this is the part where it can feel like a church. This huge organ that's placed up on the balcony, in a placement where many churches at that time have their grand organs with all the pipe facade. And these two paintings, with an explanation down below, people would come, and some people would come every year just to see these paintings. And they would talk about their spiritual experiences. So I think some shoppers, it was, oh, look at those paintings. I'm here to go get that Easter bonnet.
Yeah.
And other people were, whoa, Jesus is here. And look at that painting and connecting it to Scripture.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, so the research process for the book, it sounds like you really had a ton of fun. So you said that so these paintings are in Hungary now?
Mm-hmm.
Why are they in Hungary? Why did they wind up there?
Because they were purchased by some collectors and brought back, and actually two of them are owned by the same person, I believe, and a third by another entity, and they've decided to bring them together for a while.
What other Wanamaker historical sites did you visit in the research process?
Well, I spent a lot of time in Philly because the building is still there, the Wanamaker building. It's the same on the exterior in many ways. Inside, the main department store is then shrunk down to the grand court and some about 7 or so floors in the central part of the building, with entrances to a couple of the streets. But in the old days, it encompassed the entire building, the store, but also the storage rooms. And there was a subway station in the basement. Macy's has the core part of the store, and then its offices. And I've had friends, this has been the great thing about doing a book like Wanamaker's, you run into people who talk about grandparents growing up in the school and being a Wanamaker cadet.
Oh, wow.
You have people talking about their mom or dad having an entire career there. You have people remembering and sharing those. I get emails about once every couple of weeks that I enjoy, where people talk about going there for Christmas and the displays and Easter and what that was like. And so I have also heard stories about people who have offices who have the glass window sharing the grand court, and the grand organ is still played in the Wanamaker building, and there are friends of the Wanamaker organ who have helped with Macy's to restore it and to maintain it, and they still have a store organist. And so people in their office doing their work several times a day on a schedule can hear the great organ play.
I mean, this is one of the biggest organs in the world, isn't it?
Yes, and I mean, like anything, you have to say it right, but I believe it is the largest fully functioning organ in the world. Fully functioning being the key words there.
Unbelievable. In the book, you talk a lot about Wanamaker's house, especially in the conclusion. Did you go to the remains of the Wanamaker house, which burned down in the 70s? It was rebuilt as like a gigantic apartment building now.
Well, and there's several homes. They were extremely wealthy, and so there's the Lindenhurst that burned, and I tell that story about his art collection. There was his son's summer homes, which he named the sports club employee groups after his son's summer homes. He had his in-town home, but it looks like he had a couple. So I drove by the Walnut Street edifice, but there's not much really there. I spent most of my time in the Wanamaker building because I really wanted to experience the feel of that space. Although it has changed, what the air feels like, what the presence of the organ when you're in another part of the building and it starts playing, and how it draws you into the grand court, how it is a surprise to walk into this atrium space that is enormous and 7 stories tall and beautiful, and then this golden organ and how that organ fills the space, and then imagining both through the pictures from the archives and then my mind's eye what it would look like at Christmas when he made it into a Gothic cathedral with his artistic team of employees.
Unbelievable. And Philadelphia is really not even that far away from me. So I live in New York, and so I can drive just across the state. And over the summer, I actually drove right through Philadelphia on my way to a town in Delaware. And so it's really feasible that I will be going through Philadelphia again in the near future, and I will be doing this experience for myself. Now that I've read this book, it's going to be like added to my list of things I need to do. Did you have any like specific discoveries that made you, as like a historian of this topic, just freak out with glee and like the joy of discovery?
Oh, several. Where for a long time I felt like he was talking about a form of the prosperity gospel, and I felt like he sounded a lot like what Russell Conwell preached, but I couldn't find a connection between them initially, just because I hadn't gotten to that point in the archives. And when I found that they had a relationship, and it looked like a very close and deep relationship, that was like this aha moment. I think I may have almost shouted with glee in the archive. There was a couple of times like, oh, and again, just wow. And then looking at the images and the pictures, and just when you, like any historian, you have these questions. And another moment was this tension between his African-American workers and him saying people could move up. I couldn't find any evidence. And so I thought, I should go to historic Black newspapers. And so I went to the Chicago Defender. And that's where I found a gentleman by the last name of Scroggins, where he talked about how he had been an elevator operator for 50 years or so and had never been able to move up. And he actually had a business degree. He had all these amazing experiences. He was a leader in the African-American YMCA movement. And the Chicago Defender is criticizing Wanamakers and other places like it where, you say people can move up and you say it's open to African Americans, but it's not. And here's the evidence and the proof. And so that was a very sad moment, because I knew it. And I also, in the discussion nowadays, right now around blackface, Wanamakers, and Many, if not most, department stores of the day among white employees had minstrel teams who would put on blackface, and this was a part of their solidifying their position and the employee ranks that they would, in this racist motifs and racist entertainment, differentiate themselves from these other employees, and again trying to block the advancement of African Americans working in the store.
Well, Nicole Kirk, I'm absolutely delighted to talk to you today about your book, about the research process, about all of this history, about tying business and religion together. And I just think that this is an interesting topic that, doesn't get as much attention in society as it could. So I appreciate you and your efforts as far as putting this book together. Do you have any future projects you're working on, or can you tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you and your work?
Oh, certainly. I'm on Twitter. I have to look it up. Don't know.
Is it Prof in Chicago?
It is. It's Prof in Chicago.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. I have a website, NicoleKirk.com, and my next work, I'm going to continue working on religion and business and technology. That's a deep interest of mine. Also, where there's elements of material culture, so like the Wanamaker building.
Yeah.
So my next book is going to looking at the intersections of railroads and American religion.
Well, I will be delighted to have you back on the show to talk about that next book. Thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.